Well, hello, everybody, and welcome to another Rowing Chat podcast episode. I'm Rebecca Caro, and I founded Rowing Chat in 2013 as an interview podcast for the sport of rowing, and it's been trickling along ever since. What's been so delightful for me is the immense diversity of people who have come on the show. They've been coaches, they've been administrators, they've been athletes, and they've been totally regular folks, as well as some obviously global superstars. My goal with this is to make it a place where you find out useful stuff that might be helpful for your own rowing. And my guest today is a perfect example of that principle. I'm very happy to welcome to her first Rowing Chat podcast, Angela Schneider.
Hi, nice to be here.
So, Angela, it's great that you're here. And we have a common friend in Volker Nolte. I believe you row with him.
I do. We raced together. We raced in New Zealand together at the World Masters.
And that was the time when I met him. And of course, I obviously failed to meet you, which was an oversight on my part. Now, Angela, tell the listeners a little bit about you and your background in the sport of rowing.
So I did not start rowing until second year university. I did not know it existed. I came from a tobacco farm, and my sports were the traditional ones from the high school, which were basketball, volleyball, baseball, gymnastics, and broomball. That might be different for you folks. That's on the ice, running on the ice. But I didn't see a boat until I was 19, second year university. And the way I got recruited, I was walking across the campus and this guy comes up to me and he says, "You're tall, you look strong. Do you have a high pain tolerance?" I didn't know this guy from anybody. And I said, "Oh, yeah, so why are you asking me this?" And he says, "Because I'd like to recruit you to come out to row." And I thought, "Oh, okay." And he says, "And besides that, we have great parties." So I said, okay, well, that's definitely the criteria to me as a 19-year-old. I'm gumming. So anyway, I started rowing second year university. There was a great fit immediately. I was in the novice boat. We won every race of the season. It was like an incredible experience and entry into the sport. I went on to club rowing in the summer. We won the Canadian Championships. I tried out for the national team. And we went to the World Championships in 1983 and then the Olympics in 1984. So I had a really fast-tracked experience. And then I retired in 1985 because I was going to do a PhD. So at that time, I had finished my master's and I couldn't do them both at the same time, the PhD. I could do the master's and I could do the undergrad at the same time as training, but not the PhD. So then I left the sport for 25 years and I had 3 children and I became a professor and and the reason I came back is because Volker Nolte, who was a colleague of mine in the faculty, we were a faculty of kinesiology at that time. He came up to me and he says, "You want to come out sculling with me?" And I said, "I never sculled. I only had ever done sweep before." And he says, "I'll teach you." And Volker's a wonderful teacher. But I go down to the dock and we go to get into the double and I'm in stroke seat, he's in the bow. And there are all these university rowers standing around. This is my first time in 25 years getting back in the boat. And Volker doesn't tell me that the Germans' style was to put one foot standing onto the shell and push off with the other. We didn't do that when I raced back in 84 and 83. We got in, sat down. Right. Yep. So I'm in the front and I can't see him. I get one foot in and he pushes it off. And I'm thinking, I'm going to go into the drink head first in front of all these university students. How embarrassing this is going to be. And I fell backwards. Thank goodness. So it was towards Volker and not into the lake. Anyway, he is a masterful coach, as you probably already know. He taught me how to scull. We went on and we competed in the worlds that were in St. Catharines that year in 2010, and we won our category. I think we were the under 55 at that time. Mm-hmm. And then we went on and raced again in New Zealand when they had the World Masters in 2017, I believe it was, and we won our category at that time. So anyway, Volker has been the person who really connected me back with Masters rowing, because then I found a team called Chinook, which were women most of them at the time in this little group were about over 55 to 65. And wow, was it fantastic to get in a boat. So now I'm in the 60s, right? And in a boat of 60 women who could kick ass. And I mean kick ass. And we went to the World Masters and we won and we won and we won. And the reason is because the training program in the winter was extraordinary. We had extraordinary support, extraordinary coaches. Some of these gals never rowed in university. They only started rowing in their 40s or early 50s. It was an extraordinary, wonderful experience that I did not know existed, you know, because I had competed at the Olympic level and then retired. And so it was quite an incredible entry back into the sport. So that's my story of my involvement in rowing. So that's how I got involved and back involved again through Volker.
Well, it's welcome back from all those years ago, and how wonderful. The reason Volker thought you and I should meet is because you're an expert in drugs and sport. And I've never done a podcast episode talking about this, and it's a massive subject. And so I thought I'd ask you as a kickoff, what is the history of drugs in modern sport?
What is the intensity? Did you ask? History, right. In history. Oh, wow. So, you know, so there has always been some form of performance enhancement attempts in sport through history, including the ancient games. But in the modern era, really, there were a few particular sports that it really took off in. So the one we know really well is cycling, right? The Tour de France. So the Tour de France was a professional event. But you got to remember, these folks are riding at the time with one gear bikes. They had their tire tube slung over their neck and a wrench in their pocket. And they are racing the same length these guys are racing now over cobblestones. At that time, when people were, and this was to raise money for newspapers. It was a publicity stunt by a newspaper. At that time, what people used to use were sugar cubes that were soaked in ether, and they'd suck on them and to get performance. And I'm not kidding. Or strychnine, small amounts of strychnine, particularly for marathon runners. But the big steroid jump came actually mostly from the time when the, I'll say it just straight out, the Olympics in '56 in Melbourne when the Soviet Union joined in. And they weren't banned then. So it wasn't against the rules at that time. Right. So steroids came in then, but in things like cycling and in marathon, we had those other strange substances being used. And then we had people that would try all kinds of things. But the things that made the biggest difference, and we heard this after the 1984 games in Los Angeles, and where the cyclists came forward and said they were blood doping. So they were taking their own blood out, red blood cells, putting them in the fridge, wait till they replace their own, and then put those back into their system so that they had an increase in oxygen uptake. So there's two major categories that you could specify for doping. One is for strength, and that's the testosterone group, the steroid group, anabolics. And then one is for the cardio group, which is the aerobic uptake, and that involves increasing oxygen uptake. So the more sophisticated version of blood doping is to use something called EPO, erythropoietin, and that automatically increases your oxygen exchange. So for people that do marathons or long distance running, it's a huge help. In between those two big categories, there are some sports where stimulants are beneficial. So using cocaine in boxing. So keeping your head up and something like that. But again, it was all experimental and people could do what they want until somebody died. And somebody died in cycling. And the Prince de Merode, who was the head of the IOC Medical Commission at the time, was very good friends with this cyclist who died. It's a Danish cyclist who overdosed. Well, it wasn't an overdose that he took. It was a performance enhancement amount that he took, and he ended up as a result dying. So then all of a sudden, the IOC is very concerned about this. People are dying from this. And so it began to be against the rules. So it's only relatively recently that we have all these new and sophisticated doping rules. And so when I was racing, which was in the 80s, the big thing for the women's event in rowing was steroids, because it was 1,000 meters then, not 2,000. So we were big gals, big, strong gals. It wasn't about aerobic capacity. It was anaerobic, like 3-minute race. So when we raced the Eastern Bloc, it was a huge difference if they had anabolic steroids, and it was against the rules, but it definitely was being used. And you could see it because people weren't sophisticated with the use. You could see secondary drug use, secondary male characteristics. So drop in the voice, Adam's apple, facial hair for the women. And the reason that we found out historically why these countries, in particular East Germany, focus on the women is because it could make the biggest difference in the results. The men already have a fairly high testosterone level because they're men. So if you want big results, big changes, you give it to women. And the reason we found out all about this was when the Berlin Wall fell down, we got the Stasi files. So they kept incredible details of the research and the experiments they did on the athletes. Most of the athletes did not know they would be given steroids or any kind of performance enhancing drugs. They were told they would be given vitamins. So, and they recorded that. So I became a director at the World Anti-Doping Agency when it first was instantiated in 2000. And that is when we found out all of this information in detail. So doping became much more sophisticated after that. And beating the tests became much more sophisticated after that. And so we're in a situation now where it is the case that there's 600 substances on the banned list.
Wow.
Get your head around that.
Wow. So basically, if I understand correctly, the pathway to performance enhancing drugs was to find a new drug that stayed ahead of the banned list. And then following behind that is the drug testing to check whether or not it's been used.
That's right. And it was always a catch-up game.
Yes.
The tester's always trying to catch up to the users. And that's when it became cheating, by the way, from an ethics perspective. Yeah. Before, it was not banned and against the rules. It was a type of training enhancement, right? And people experimented, people did it, but people in sport did that all the time, right?
Yeah.
It was when it became against the rules because people realized some of the huge advantages, in particular in women's sport, that could be gained by using something like anabolic steroids. So that's when the ethical issues really multiplied. So it became a game of deception and trying to catch the cheaters. And so it really is the case that the list that we have now has 3 criteria that WADA uses for what's going to be put on there. So how do we get these things on the list? How do we get 600? Well, it has to be 2 of the 3 of these things. It has to be harmful or performance enhancing or against the spirit of sport. So you've got those 3 criteria. It's got to be 2 of those 3 to get on the list. So some people are saying, well, why do we have marijuana on there? It's not performance enhancing. And if you take it in small amounts, it's certainly not harmful, really, at the end of the day, compared to some of these other things we're talking about, right? So some people, I do know why it got put on the list, because at the time we were trying to bring all the countries onto the World Anti-Doping Code and sign on, General Barry McCaffrey from the United States was fighting his own battles in the US against marijuana. And he said, we're not signing on unless marijuana is on the list, because we want to do it. We want it on there because we want it dealt with. Now, not one scientist sitting at the table said, well, it's performance enhancing and really harmful, but it was to get them to sign on. We put marijuana on it. Similarly, at the same time, we put caffeine on because the South Americans wanted caffeine because they had an abuse problem with their athletes, because the athletes kept thinking more is better. Yeah. It's actually only the equivalent of 2 cups of coffee that is performance enhancing, and it's not a biggie. It's it helps a little bit, but a lot of the athletes were abusing it and they were getting problems from the caffeine. So the South Americans didn't have the money to do an education program. So they said, we want it on the ban list. So subsequently, caffeine's been taken off because medals were stripped. Athletes lost their medals for caffeine. And we all enjoy caffeine all around the world. Nobody has big moral objections with caffeine. So it has got a pretty contentious history, this ban list.
Wow. And of course, an enormous amount of politics that comes into it rather than just medical science.
Right. And the medical science, frankly, is not great, Rebecca, because we can't do the research on human subjects. It won't pass an ethics review board. So we do it on mice and rats. And we extrapolate, but we don't know. So it's really interesting because it's hard to do the research, right? So there have been some scientists who have found folks who are in professional bodybuilding who are on anabolic steroids who just offered for them to follow them, what they were already using in training. And it wasn't banned at that time in bodybuilding. So there was some research coming from that from human subjects. But where it really comes from is the military.
Okay.
Right. So where do we want performance enhancement more than anywhere? The soldiers. Right. Yeah. So most people don't know about that. And they don't know about that connection. So sport is sort of, it's on the cutting edge, but it's actually just behind the military.
Okay. And the military are allowed to experiment on human subjects?
Yes, they are. We all know the stories about that, right? So it's, so there, I'm not an expert on military history. My expertise is sport and doping, but I was involved when I was at WADA with people who were involved with military aspects of performance enhancement. So let's just put it that way, that they had better scientific evidence from a human perspective than we do in the sport realm, because in universities, ethics review boards will not pass protocols that intentionally dope, intentionally try to increase performance enhancement when there's some kind of risk to their health, right? You can't justify it, right? So that kind of research is limited. But there is lots of research there that is on mice, rodents, rats. And the biggest one is not steroids anymore. Steroids looks like Smarties. It's genetic doping.
What is genetic doping?
So gene transfer technology that was designed to save deathly ill and sickly people. So, the kids that have the autoimmune deficiencies that have to be in the bubble, the boy in the bubble, the stories where they can't be exposed because they have no immunity. Gene transfer technology was designed to help that, to transfer, to turn on immune systems. But it's very experimental. Sickle cell anemia, things like that. Like people have used it for people that are very, very ill. So WADA brought in these scientists to one of their conferences because they had coaches calling them up and they had athletes calling them up because they wanted access to the transfer technology, because two of them were in those two big categories I told you about, which is about strength or endurance, right? So the one is called marathon mouse. It was an experiment that was done with gene transfer technology, which is like turning on the light switch of your own genes, activating it, right? So the oxygen uptake was huge without training. So here's the results of this type of transfer technology. They took 3 or 4 fully trained field mice. So field mice run for miles in the field, but very fit. And they took an untrained lab mouse. They did the gene transfer technology. You can Google this. You can watch it on YouTube. You will see, called marathon mouse gene transfer technology. And they ran them on little treadmills, giving them little shocks, which probably wouldn't pass an animal ethics committee now, but that's when they did it. So that when the animals got tired, they got shocked to keep running. Right. So the field mice are running, and they get shocked. And then finally they don't get up again. They just go off the treadmill, off the back. But marathon mouse keeps running. And marathon mouse, totally untrained with gene transfer technology, runs for 2 hours longer. 2 hours. This took no training. This is an injection. Right. So this is a quantum leap from EPO and blood doping. Wow. On the other side, the Schwarzenegger rat. So you've seen probably photos of what they call the double muscle Belgian bull. These bulls that they look like they've got Schwarzenegger's trapezius. They're so muscled. Mm-hmm. It's actually a mutation. And they were able to do it with the gene transfer technology into rats. So they took the equivalent of an 80-year-old, in person terms, rat, injected them with this gene transfer technology to increase their muscle strength. And the muscle strength increased so much. There's again, you got to look this up on YouTube. Look up the Schwarzenegger rat or Schwarzenegger mouse. The scientist's name was Lee Sweeney from Penn State University in the United States. And the muscle grew so much that the infrastructure couldn't hold it. The muscle sheath split. The bones could hardly hold that muscle. Yeah. It has occurred in nature a couple times. If you Google baby Popeye, a former East German sprinter gave birth to a baby who had that mutation naturally. And there's a picture of him at 2 years old holding his arm straight out with a weight. It looks like about 5 to 10 pounds. Wow. Fairly strong kid. And he's not doped. That's just the mutation. But anyway, you can cause it through this gene transfer technology. So those are the two biggies that make steroids and blood doping look like Smarties. Now,
and how do you test it?
So you can't test for it. That's the problem, right? Because it's like finding the needle in the haystack. You have to find the injection site. You have to find exactly where it was put in the body, and you don't have control of it. Many people die after they use this technology because it turns on all kinds of other things. So the SCIDS kids, the ones that I was telling you about, the boy in the bubble, when they first discovered this gene transfer technology to help them, they ended up, a large majority of them, dying of cancer, leukemia, blood cancer, because it was a side effect, because they had no control. Once that was put into their body, it takes on its own life. You don't have control. So what WADA did when they found out about this, that these scientists were being asked for this gene transfer technology for sport performance, is they asked them if they can put a marker into the technology so that it shows up the fluorescent green. So if I take a light and I run it over you, you're going to shine green. You've probably seen photos of the green monkey on Time magazine, I believe it was, that they had doing that. But anyway, the problem with this from an ethics perspective is that technology was designed to save people that are dying. And it is already extremely experimental and potentially deadly. To introduce another variable so we can catch dopers like a fluorescent green, which could cause the people that are actually needing it, for life and death reasons, to become, this whole scientific project becomes much more complicated for sport. So people took a step back and say, what are we doing this for? This is sport. Like, are we really going to introduce this technology and it's going to affect these people that are already using it for life and death reasons, just so we can catch dopers and cheaters? So that's sort of the short version of where we came to right now. Now, people still use conventional doping, like this testosterone, the anabolic steroids, and the blood doping and EPO. But there are some athletes who have also used gene transfer technology.
And have not been caught?
And have not been caught, because they now, WADA thinks they now have a test, a way of testing it. Again, that's like trying to stay ahead of the curve. And it's not, availability is a question. You don't need a lot of money. You need $100,000 US and a postdoc in a lab, and you can create this stuff.
Oh.
So it's not like it's extortionate and expensive and hard to do. But athletes, I think, are aware how incredibly experimental it is. But in countries where athletes aren't protected very much, and there is that kind of potential in regimes that don't value human rights really highly, sometimes that experimentation has been known to have occurred.
So poor WADA, I mean, they have an unenviable task of playing whack-a-mole against the ingeniousness of the human race.
Yes, and it gets worse. The reason it gets worse is up until the 2016 Russian doping scandal, WADA's expertise was on the lab side, right? We get a urine test from you or a blood test from you, and we test for that analytically in our labs, and we can tell if you're doping. Now, you may have heard how people have tried to beat the tests. Yeah. So it's really hard to beat a blood test because they're taking it right out of your arm or wherever.
And they see it come out.
Yes, you see it come out. But urine tests are another story. So the way some athletes beat the urine tests when they first started doing this is they would get clean urine from somebody else and use a catheter and put it up in their bladder.
Yeah.
You have to be pretty good on your timing and sophisticated on this to do this, but they did, and they managed to get away with it. And also, it was the case then that WADA changed the timing of the testing so that the athletes wouldn't know. So they did what they called unannounced out of competition testing because they couldn't then beat the test. So that was one step. But then at the Russian doping scandal, as I'm sure you probably heard, the equivalent of the FSB, which was the former KGB, were involved with swapping samples and cheating the lab. So it became an espionage level. So WADA had to become sophisticated, not just in the lab, they had to be sophisticated in intelligence. Wow. Because we have athletes that needed protection, that were whistleblowers, that needed to get out of the country. So, you know, this is on another level again. So yes, WADA's got a really challenging situation. It is really hard.
Taking all of that, and obviously the best goodwill in the world, and you know, WADA is probably never going to be as well funded as it needs to be. They will continue to strive, and I have no doubt that, you know, they will do their best. Let's focus then on the actual competitive athletes. How do they bend the rules? Because I did a previous interview with someone called Tristan McLaughlin, who in his informal research, not being quoted on the record directly with athletes, is he says they will do anything right up to the rule. They will do their utmost. Is this normal? Is that your knock on the door?
I've got somebody upstairs. I'm okay. I've got a few more minutes. It's okay. We got.
Is it, you know, is it normal? Is it ethical to do your best within the rules?
So here's the situation that we have with interpretations of the rules. Following the letter of the rule and following the spirit of the rule are two different things. The reason the rule is implemented is to try and ensure as best we can fair play. We're never going to have perfection. It's never going to be a completely level playing field, but we do the best we can to try and make it as fair as we possibly can. And that's why we put these rules here. We try and make it as fair as we can, given the circumstances of life. Now, that's the spirit of the rule. When you are interpreting a rule as the letter of the rule and you try and bend it as much as you can without breaking it, that's called gamesmanship. And that's probably less morally reprehensible than a cheat, but it is still not following the spirit of it, because the spirit of it was to try and ensure some form of fairness. Now, people don't say that these people are cheating, and people say, well, that happens in professional sport all the time, and that's one of the skills. That's one of our skills. How far can we bend it? How far can we say we're following the letter of the rule without breaking it to gain an advantage? And that's not necessarily considered unfair because it didn't break the rule. But is that people that we hold up on a pedestal and say that's wonderful, we want to celebrate their character? The good sport is the person who embraces the spirit of the rule and says, I want to win on my own terms because I am the best in the realm of fairness and as much as we can do it. So that's the debate. moral character. So these people that bend the rules, they're not cheats, and they're trying to gain an advantage, and they want to win. Winning is obviously extremely important, but winning is also extremely important for the good sport. But they want the win to mean something, that in 20 years' time, they go look in the mirror and they say, you know what, that medal, that win is really worth it. I did that myself. But, you have also different cultural interpretations about the rules. And referees, and depending on the sport, you can have some incredible cultural diversity. So let's say the ones that do the dives in soccer, we call it soccer. I know in the UK they call it football. That's another game for us. But, diving, what diving is when you fake an injury or falling down when you haven't actually been hit. That's not that's not part of the culture in some countries, but it is part of the culture in other countries. Yeah. And in fact, it's more of male sport than female sport in soccer. Females do that far less than males do. So they're bending the rules, they're not breaking them, and they're trying to gain an advantage. And people are saying, well, is that the skill we want to celebrate in sport? Bending rules? Yeah. Because those people then go out in society and they become CEOs and they become the head of companies. Do we want them bending the rules, or do we want them to follow the spirit of what the rule is there for? And that would be the laws usually of the land. So it's an interesting question about what we want to celebrate in sport, and the question of how much we care about fairness, fair play, and the good sport.
And how do you address something as complex as that, as multi-layered, particularly, as you say, with cultural sensitivities?
So my own theory is about respect for the game and respect for the opponent. It's about respect. And if I respect you and I respect myself and I respect the sport, then I want the best match possible with following the spirit of the game. Mm-hmm. And that's an internal quality assessment, internal decision that we make. We can never know. We can't get inside of everybody's head, and know what they're thinking or what their intentions are. We can only see the results of their actions. And, for me, I value fair play and the good sport because I just think it makes sport better and it makes us better people. So why shouldn't sport make us better people? And why does it have to be the case? Many people are arguing sport makes us worse people because of this, and cheating and doping and all these things. It doesn't have to be that way. And in fact, we can get so much more out of it if we actually celebrate some of the most fantastic things and fantastic people that we know that really support the spirit of the game and are the good sports.
There is a range of sanctions that can be taken against athletes, but these vary between different sports. Some have a 3 strikes and you're out rule, and others have variants on that. Do you have a view as to what the best way to go is?
Well, if we tie it back to the doping conversation, boy, this has been all over the map. For the doping, first of all, I think it has to really be simplified. That list needs to be reduced down to the big Cadillac drugs and forget the rest. I don't care if you have caffeine. I don't care if you have marijuana. That's got really nothing to do with sport performance. Let's get down to the real drugs that really cause enhancement. And we know what they are. And let's focus on that because it costs money to do every one of these tests. It costs money. Yeah. And you take that, and that money goes out of sport. I'd rather have it in sport. So that's number one. Number two is consistency in the rules. So, depending on the sport, an athlete's career lifetime, it really varies. Some of them are very short. So a penalty of 2 years for some athletes is like the equivalent of 4 to 8 for another athlete who might have a long lifetime career. So justice really has to take into account sport-specific discussions. And people don't like that because they want one rule for everybody. But the problem is everybody's not the same. Every sport's not the same. And every drug is not the same. So we really have to have some nuancing. I think we have to have minimum penalties, but I also think we have to have maximum penalties too. Because athletes have rights. Why do we care so much about doping? Like, why does it make such a big difference as opposed to people who bend the rules? Like, why is doping the big thing? And it's really interesting. We are a drug taking society. We take cold medicine, we take coffee, we do, Jolt, the caffeine drinks. We smoke cigarettes, we smoke marijuana. Why is it that we are so concerned about athletes? So I would argue that it's about fair play, actually, that we should be concerned about, not these other things that we're talking about, behaviors in society. I'm talking about respecting each other, respecting the game, and respecting the rules. So that's where I think the focus needs to go. We have sort of thrown all our money and attention into this huge list, and I think it just needs to get focused down and shortened significantly and intensified significantly for the things that are really important.
Is there currently a minimum and maximum penalty?
Yeah, so usually it's 2 years. You do get, so here's the question. There's things called inadvertent doping.
Yeah.
So this is where you get a doping infraction and you didn't actually intend to dope. I don't know if you remember Andrea Raducan from Romania in the Sydney Olympics in 2000. She's a little girl, gymnastics. I don't know, she was maybe 15. She was treated by her doctor for bad cold, bad treatment. And the doctor gave her a substance that was on the banned list. And she certainly followed the prescription. They stripped her medal.
Yeah.
I would argue that was wrong because there was no intention to dope. And this doctor was responsible for knowing what was on the banned list. She was a minor, and they still stripped her medal. So that's too strong. That's gone too far for me, because that's not justice.
Is there any hope, Angela, for drugs in sport?
Well, I do think we have to scale it, our focus back significantly and get rid of the small stuff and not sweat the small stuff. I really do think we have to. And also, why are we testing in certain situations? Some people said to me, why do we test in masters? Like, why do we care if masters people use something to it's an ability enhancer to even be able to do the activity, not just go and win, but they may need it to even get into the boat, to get the boat on the water. When you age, doing those things is much more challenging than when you're younger. And so what are our priorities here? Why do we want to spend money on that for masters? Do we really care that much? Like, are masters athletes likely to do genetic doping? I don't think so. Are they likely to do anabolic steroids? Possibly, but they're also probably doing that with anti-aging regimes.
Yeah.
So I think we do need to look at the context of the sport and the doping and the question. And I think focusing on the Olympic Games and focusing on trying to keep as much as we can of a level playing field in there, and the costs that it requires. So athletes have to forfeit their rights, right? So if they're going to be able to test you unannounced out of competition anytime, it means I can come and knock at your door anytime, 24 hours a day, and say, drop your drawers and give me a urine sample right here. That's a violation of my rights to privacy. So you better have a very good reason. We don't have a good reason to do that with masters athletes. We don't. Yeah. We've got a good reason to probably test for some things on the day of the event at the event, but I would argue it really needs to be reassessed and put into perspective. I'm completely in favor of us continuing to have a banned list and to have prohibitions against certain practices and substances, but I do think we need to do a reset button.
And if you're in domestic competition, are juniors testable, or is it only over 18s?
They're testable if they can get consent from the guardian, and that varies sport by sport.
Okay.
Right, because if you take blood from a minor, that's assault if you don't have consent.
Right.
That's an assault.
And of course,
you've invaded their body.
That's right. So some sports have some incredibly high-performing 15-year-olds. Swimming is a very obvious example. Rowing has high-performing, but they're not, international quality generally at that age. It takes years.
Yeah. So yes, I mean, And in that case, you could argue a paternalistic grounds, saying that in fact you might be protecting minors to test, to try and prevent others who would dope them, like doping racehorses.
Mhm.
You know, these are minors. They can't really consent technically. So
legally,
yeah. So in fact, it should be focused on the people that are actually giving it to them. The whole focus of the penalty system, the whole focus of the education, the whole focus of protecting the minors from that. And they deserve our protection from that. Nobody deserves to get doped. When you read those Stasi files and you see the women seeing that one of the things the female athlete is shocked because she sees that her pubic hair is now running from her navel to her knees. One of the side effects of the drugs. She's traumatized. Wow. Yeah. Oh. So nobody deserves to have that, right? They're human beings. And minors in particular need to be protected from this. So it's serious stuff.
Let's talk about rowing a little bit. There have been incidences where rowers have been tested positive. Do you think there's a lot of drug taking in rowing?
You know, I can speak more about women's than men's just because of my experience. I know when I was racing, there was no question. Absolutely. There was no WADA. Was nobody, you know, they took the odd test. And also it was 1,000 meters. So there was a much greater benefit in particular to the use of anabolics at that time. So yes, it did occur then. I think, in fact, part of the motivation when I was at the meetings when they made the decision to go to 2,000 meters. And I think part of the motivation was to strike back against the Eastern Bloc because it was no longer an advantage to take anabolic steroids if you're racing 2,000 meters. So I do think there was a decrease in the use of that drug in women's rowing after the event was changed from 1,000 to 2,000. So I do think there was a difference there. Rowing is an event that could benefit from some performance enhancement. There's no question about it. But I think overall, compared to other sports, we're in the lower category. And part of that's our culture. I don't know about you folks, but you can't even smoke a cigarette at a rowing course without feeling completely ostracized. So I think we have a different culture. Whereas some of the problem sports like powerlifting, you know, the short sprints have a history of doping, and I think they have greater problems than rowing does from a doping perspective.
I think the amount of money in the sport is also an influencing factor. We know that rowing is the last $1 billion uncommercialized sport. And, you know, the wonderful clean green image of, you know, fair play and so on is partly because there aren't any, you know, big cash prizes to go for. Whereas, you know, if you're in basketball, you know, boy, can you make a lot of money if you're a super successful athlete. Yeah. And, you know, the temptations must be there for not just the athletes.
True. Yeah. So I'm just looking, I do have the knock. Do you have a final question for me, Rebecca?
I want to be optimistic, Angela. Is there any cause for optimism?
Yes, because there's good reason to celebrate sport. There's good reason to celebrate excellence. There's good reason to celebrate respecting human beings and striving, because I think those things are all wonderful things about sport. And that's what we need to focus on and bring back. And some people have it. Some sports have it. And I think we need to celebrate that.
And on that note, Angela, it's been a delight having you on Rowing Chat with me. Thank you for your expertise, for an amazing canter through the history of drugs in sport. And I have learned so much from you.
It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Rebecca.
And to our listeners, please subscribe on all the podcast channels that you know. And until next time, bye-bye.